It was a quiet Thursday morning when I realized just how much I cherished the stillness of my little cul-de-sac. Tucked into a cookie-cutter suburb, where every lawn looked like it had been trimmed by a laser-guided mower, and mailboxes stood like sentinels of suburban order, my house had always been my sanctuary. Birds chirped, sprinklers hissed in rhythm, and dogs barked in distant, polite tones. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, peaceful, predictable, and wrapped in the kind of routine that makes life feel manageable. Of course, every neighborhood has its quirks, and ours came with a particularly persistent one named Karen. Not just any Karen, the Karen. Short platinum bob, wraparound sunglasses, and a clipboard that she wielded like a sheriff's badge. She was the self-appointed enforcer of our homeowners association, despite already having a real title on the board, and she treated the bylaws like scripture. Her war on garden gnomes, porch flags, and non-compliant trash bins was legendary. Still, I kept my distance, trimmed my hedges, and nodded politely when she waved during her morning patrol. Most of us had learned to live around her, like you'd live around a broken tile in the kitchen. Just step over it and move on. But deep down, I always sensed that one day she'd push a little too far, cross a line that even the HOA handbook didn't have a rule for. I just never imagined it would involve my garage, that sacred oil-stained space where I stored my tools, my camping gear, and a dusty bike I swore I'd ride someday. That Thursday morning, as the sun lit up my front lawn and the smell of fresh-cut grass filled the air, I had no idea the storm that was quietly brewing behind the hedge across the street. Karen's campaign of pettiness didn't start with a bang. It was more like a slow drip. At first, it was almost amusing. She slid a printed notice under my door, typed in bold Times New Roman, informing me that my grass had exceeded the approved neighborhood blade height. I measured it, 2 3/4 inches. But fine, I trimmed it. The next week, she left a note about my trash bins. Apparently, they were visible from the street for an unacceptable duration. I had wheeled them out the night before pickup like everyone else, but somehow, my bins had violated the aesthetic sanctity of the cul-de-sac. Then came the flag situation. I had hung a small vintage Route 66 flag near my porch. Not political, not offensive, just nostalgic. But according to Karen, it hadn't been pre-approved by the HOA board. She left a violation slip taped to my front door like it was a parking ticket. When I asked during the next HOA meeting if the board had voted on banning porch flags, she just smiled and said it was under temporary review. Of course, no one else seemed to have gotten the same memo, just me. She had a talent for finding problems that didn't exist. A stray leaf on the walkway, a slip hazard, a wind chime, noise pollution, my front porch light, too bright and disruptive to the nocturnal ambience. Every week, some new imagined offense made its way into my mailbox or onto my doorknob, always accompanied by that sanctimonious tone that only someone truly drunk on authority could muster. What made it worse was how she operated. Always polite on the surface, always smiling that tight-lipped smile that never quite reached her eyes. If I tried to push back, she'd tilt her head, feign concern, and say something like, "Oh, I'm just following the rules for everyone's benefit. Don't you want to keep our community beautiful?" It was a rhetorical trap, and she was a master at it. Still, I let it slide. I chalked it up to neighborhood politics, and figured if I kept to myself, she'd eventually get bored. But Karen wasn't looking for peace. She was looking for control. And eventually, she was going to try to take more than just my peace of mind. It was a Saturday morning when it happened, the kind of morning where nothing feels urgent, and the sun filters in through the curtains like warm silk. I had plans to do absolutely nothing. Maybe clean out the garage, maybe not. I padded downstairs in my slippers, coffee in hand, and hit the garage button. The door groaned, shuddered, and slowly rolled up, revealing the last thing I expected to see. A silver SUV, large, gleaming, and completely unfamiliar, parked dead center inside my garage. I stood there in a stunned haze, blinking at the sight. My workbench had been nudged aside. A stack of neatly organized moving boxes was slightly crushed along the wall. Her SUV was taking up every inch of available space like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. My garage, my private, locked, never-shared garage. For a moment, I actually questioned whether I'd left the door open overnight. Had I sleepwalked and let someone in? Was I dreaming? But no, on the windshield, tucked neatly under the wiper, was a note written in looped, aggressive cursive on HOA letterhead. I pulled it off and read, "Hi, needed a bit of shade for the afternoon. Your garage was open and empty. I figured it wouldn't be a problem. Back later. Karen." There it was. The smiley face. The passive aggression distilled into ink. She had not asked. She had not called. She had not knocked. She had assumed, barged in, and helped herself like my property was some sort of shared community resource listed in the HOA bylaws under optional amenities. My coffee cooled rapidly in my hand as I tried to make sense of the audacity. I stepped around the vehicle, examining the sheer disregard for boundaries. Her SUV had dragged in gravel, left oil drops, and bumped one of my shelving units enough to scatter a few paint cans across the floor. I called her. No answer. Texted. Read receipt. No reply. Then came the slow realization that she fully expected me to be okay with this. That her back later wasn't an apology. It was a declaration. By noon, I'd sat with my anger long enough to know it wasn't going away. This wasn't a stray trash bin complaint. This wasn't some HOA nitpick I could shrug off. This was a trespass. An invasion. I walked back out, looked at the SUV one last time, and something in me shifted. The line she crossed wasn't just physical. It was the last one she'd ever cross without consequences. I closed the garage door slowly, deliberately, listening to the final clank of the metal settling into place. Then I went to the hardware store and bought a new lock, something heavy-duty. Karen had parked in the wrong garage, and now she wasn't getting out. By the time I got back from the hardware store, the sun had dipped low enough to throw long shadows across the lawn. I stood in my driveway with the new lock cradled in one hand and a screwdriver in the other, staring at the garage door like it was a stage and the final act was about to begin. I wasn't just irritated anymore. I was insulted. Karen hadn't just taken space, she'd taken liberty. And the worst part, she expected silence. Compliance. She thought I'd just swallow it. Not this time. I replaced the garage's electronic opener with a manual deadbolt, the kind you couldn't override with a remote or code. I wanted something that said permanence, something that clicked with finality. It took less than 20 minutes, but every twist of the screwdriver felt like reclaiming a little dignity. I tightened the last bolt and gave the door a shove. Solid, impenetrable, Karen-proof. Then I went inside, printed a note, and taped it to the garage door. It read, "Garage in use. Temporary access unavailable. Thank you for understanding." Polite, vague, unapologetically passive-aggressive, just the way Karen liked it. Except now, the shoe was on the other foot. I poured a drink, settled on the couch, and stared at my phone. Still no response from Karen. No missed calls, no messages asking if she could swing by to grab her car. The arrogance was almost artistic. She truly believed she could just waltz in and out of someone else's property like it was a public parking structure. But now, the gears in my head were spinning, not with rage, but with possibility. I opened a travel app. A cabin in the mountains caught my eye, secluded, surrounded by pine trees. No cell service unless you stood on one specific rock behind the lodge. It was perfect. I booked it on the spot. If Karen wanted to treat my garage like her personal valet service, she'd have to learn what happens when you take liberties without asking. By morning, I'd packed a bag, left a timer light on in the living room, and shut off the garage opener from the breaker panel. No remote, no keypad, just a deadbolt and the sound of my tires crunching out of the driveway. I smiled as I passed her house. Curtains twitched. I didn't wave. As I merged onto the highway, my phone buzzed. It was her. A text. "Hey, just trying to grab my SUV. You around?" I didn't answer. I tossed the phone into the glove box, turned up the music, and let the wind take the last of my irritation. Karen could wait. She'd taken my space. Now I was taking my time. Let's see how she liked playing by someone else's rules for a change. The mountains welcomed me like an old friend. Crisp air, towering pines, and a silence so pure it made me realize how much noise I'd been carrying. No HOA notices tucked under my door. No sideways glances across the street. No platinum blonde silhouettes lurking behind hedges. Just the low crackle of a fireplace and the distant rustling of trees brushing against one another like old souls whispering secrets. The cabin was small, but perfect. Wood-paneled walls, a lofted bed, and a view of the lake that caught the sunrise like glass catching fire. I spent the first day doing nothing, which felt strange at first, like I was forgetting something. But by the time I dipped my toes into the cold edge of the water and watched the sky bleed into dusk, I remembered what it felt like to breathe deeply, to exist without being watched, judged, or warned. Karen, of course, did not take long to rear her digital head. By the second evening, I had 2 missed calls and a flood of texts. "Hey, I really need to grab my car. Can you unlock the garage? This is starting to get serious. Please respond." I scrolled through them with a glass of wine in one hand and my feet propped up on the porch railing. Each message seemed to grow a little more frantic, a little more desperate, and honestly, a little more satisfying. I didn't reply. I wasn't ignoring her. I was on vacation. On the third day, a new number messaged me. The HOA president, a man named Doug, whose only role before this had been nodding too much at meetings and nervously sipping from a Starbucks tumbler. "Hi there. Karen mentioned there's a bit of a misunderstanding with your garage. Is there a time we can talk?" No, Doug. There was no misunderstanding. There was just an SUV in a garage it didn't belong in, and a woman who thought courtesy was optional. I let a day pass before texting back. "Hi, Doug. Sorry, spotty service up here. Just on a short retreat. Be back next week. No details, no promises. Just vague enough to seem polite. Just clear enough to mean, not your problem." Each morning I checked my phone while sipping coffee by the fire, just to see the new additions. Karen had gone from polite reminders to subtle threats. I'll have to escalate this. The HOA may need to take formal action. One message simply read, "You're being very unfair." I almost laughed out loud. Unfair. This woman had trespassed into my home, helped herself to my space without asking, and expected a thank you. I hadn't towed her car. I hadn't called the police. I'd simply given her a chance to sit in her own entitlement for a while. And the view from here, high above the cul-de-sac, wrapped in pine and peace, was worth every unread message. By day 5 of my retreat, the tone of Karen's messages had shifted from politely annoyed to full-blown unhinged. The smiley faces had vanished, replaced by all caps and threats of legal action. I scrolled through them while sipping hot cocoa on the porch, watching a pair of deer nibble at the brush near the tree line. Karen was unraveling, and I wasn't even there to see it happen. That almost made it better. She had clearly exhausted the polite route, and now began escalating the situation in every direction she could. She sent an email, CCing the HOA board, the neighborhood attorney, and even someone she labeled as Community Compliance Coordinator. which I suspected was just her cousin with a free Gmail account. The subject line read, "Emergency HOA intervention request." The body of the message was pure drama. "My vehicle is being unlawfully held hostage in another resident's garage, which I used only briefly during a moment of need. I fear this situation could escalate, if not resolved swiftly." It was dripping with victimhood, like she had accidentally parked in my garage while fleeing a forest fire. Doug, ever the nervous peacemaker, forwarded the message to me with a comment. "Hey, can we maybe chat when you're back? Just want to make sure things don't get too tense." I didn't reply. Let them stew. I was roasting marshmallows over an open fire. By the next day I heard from a neighbor, Jerry, the retired guy who always washed his car twice a day and somehow knew everyone's business. He messaged me a blurry photo of Karen standing outside my garage with a man in a polo shirt holding a clipboard. "She tried to get a locksmith," Jerry wrote. "Didn't work. Guy needed proof she had rights to the property. She flipped. Apparently, she'd paced my driveway for a full hour afterward, talking loudly on speakerphone with what Jerry guessed was her lawyer. When the locksmith refused service without documentation, she'd tried claiming the garage was part of shared HOA space, which it wasn't. She'd been informed, on record, that it was exclusive, deeded property. That only made her angrier. Karen stormed off, only to return later with her phone held high, recording herself narrating her plight for what she later claimed was evidence of hostile neighbor behavior. The neighborhood buzzed with the drama. Kids rode past on bikes shouting, "Free the SUV," and neighbors whispered over fences about the woman who finally met a line she couldn't cross. Jerry even started a running tally on how long the garage standoff had lasted, updating it with sidewalk chalk in front of my driveway. When I saw the photo, I laughed so hard, I nearly spilled my cocoa. Karen had built an entire empire on enforcing rules. But now that those rules didn't serve her, she was falling apart. And the best part? I hadn't raised my voice, filed a complaint, or sent a single threat. I'd just locked a door and taken a very long walk away. I pulled into my driveway just after noon, a full week since I'd left. The neighborhood looked the same, but it felt different, like the tension had settled into the cracks between the sidewalks and the hedges. I stepped out of my car and stretched, letting the sun warm my shoulders. Across the street, blinds snapped shut, curtains fluttered. Word had clearly gotten around. Karen was already waiting. She stood at the edge of my property like she was guarding it, arms crossed, sunglasses reflecting my every step. Her SUV was still tucked inside my garage, but she looked like she hadn't slept in days. She marched toward me the moment I reached the porch. "We need to talk," she snapped. I calmly unlocked my front door without replying. "I've been more than patient," she continued, following me. "You've created a hostile environment. You've violated community cooperation expectations, and you've denied me access to my personal property." I turned and looked at her, letting the silence do most of the talking. She was waiting for an apology. What she got instead was a slow, deliberate reply. "You parked in my garage without permission. You left a note, not a request, not a question, a declaration. I didn't steal your car. I secured my property." She scoffed. "It was open. I thought it was fine." "You thought wrong," I cut in. "And now we're here." That evening, the HOA called an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. Karen arrived with a folder thick enough to choke a paper shredder. She laid out printed emails, highlighted excerpts from the HOA charter, and screenshots of her own messages. Her voice quivered as she claimed I'd humiliated her, violated the spirit of community, and possibly committed unlawful detainment of a vehicle. She tried to frame herself as the victim, just a concerned neighbor wronged by a vindictive homeowner. When it was my turn, I stood and calmly produced my own evidence. I showed the photos of her SUV parked in my locked garage. I read her note aloud. I explained in detail that the garage was deeded property, not community space. I played back a voicemail from the locksmith she hired, confirming she couldn't provide documentation proving any right to access. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I let the facts do what they were made to do, flatten her argument. The board sat in silence for a moment after I finished. Then Doug cleared his throat and said, "We believe this was an unfortunate misuse of private property. Karen, you'll be fined for trespassing and unauthorized vehicle storage." Karen's mouth dropped open, but no words came out. Someone in the back coughed, possibly to stifle a laugh. She left without another word, her shoes clicking hard against the tile, like a judge's gavel striking too late. I walked home under a calm evening sky, unlocked my garage, and left it wide open. Empty now, peaceful again. Karen had played her last card, and she'd lost it all in someone else's driveway. 2 days after the meeting, an official letter from the HOA was hand-delivered to every mailbox on the street. It was unusually formal, complete with embossed letterhead and unnecessarily legal language. But the message was clear. Karen had been removed from her position on the HOA board due to a serious breach of community trust and misuse of private property. Her privileges as a voting member were suspended indefinitely. There would be no appeal. Neighbors began talking more openly now, no longer whispering or glancing over their shoulders. People I'd barely spoken to stopped me on walks to shake my hand, or laugh softly and say things like, "About time someone stood up to her." Even Jerry left a celebratory message on my voicemail that ended with, "If you ever run for HOA president, you've got my vote." Karen, on the other hand, became a shadow of her former self. No more patrols with a clipboard. No more morning power walks with her head held high. She stopped attending community meetings. Her front yard, once obsessively manicured, began to look almost average. And for the first time since I'd moved in, I could breathe without feeling like I was being watched. She did eventually retrieve her SUV, quietly, with the help of a towing company that didn't ask questions. I didn't speak to her when she came by. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, and watched from a distance as she avoided eye contact and refused to look in my direction. The woman who once knocked on doors to report misplaced recycling bins now couldn't bring herself to knock on mine. Then, a week later, a new sign appeared in front of her house. Bold red letters, planted in the grass. For sale. No announcement, no farewell, just a silent surrender. The neighborhood didn't mourn her departure. If anything, it exhaled. Barbecues started popping up again. Kids played louder. A few neighbors even brought out porch decorations that had once earned stern warnings. One family put up wind chimes, and no one said a word. I never gloated. I never rubbed it in. That would have made me no better than her. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the scent of grilled burgers drifted through the air, I pulled up a lawn chair in my driveway. I cracked open a drink and sat there, just watching the street breathe and stretch like it had been under pressure for too long. The garage door was wide open behind me, empty and quiet. No SUV, no Karen, just space. Beautiful, unobstructed space that belonged only to me. She thought she could take what wasn't hers and walk away like nothing happened. But this time, someone shut the door behind her and made sure it stayed locked. Justice had never looked so ordinary or so satisfying. Months passed, and the for sale sign out front eventually changed to sold. One morning, a moving truck arrived, and Karen stood silently on her porch, arms folded, watching strangers carry boxes of her carefully curated life into the back. She didn't wave. No one came to say goodbye. When the truck pulled away, the street felt lighter, like a heavy curtain had been lifted. That night, as I sat in my driveway with a quiet breeze drifting past, I raised a glass toward her empty house. Not in bitterness, but in relief. Peace had finally come home, for all of us.